this learning module, we're going to see more advanced file input and output functions. We've seen the use of load and save when reading into or writing from a matrix, but when you can't use load and save, we need to use lower level file input and output functions to read from or write to or append to files. MATLAB also has many functions that read from and write to different file types, for example, spreadsheets. And MATLAB also has a special binary file type that can be used to store both variables and their contents in what are called .mate files, files that have an extension of .mat. If a file has the same number of values on every line and they're all the same type, then we can use load to read from the file into a matrix. Similarly, if we have a matrix, we can use save to write to or append the matrix to a file. If what you have isn't so regular, for example, if you have different types of things on the lines in the file, or you have different number of values in the different lines in the file, then you can't use load. And if you want to do something like writing sentence formats to a file, then you can't use save. So in those cases, we have to use lower level file input and output functions. When we use these lower level file I/O functions, we have to start by opening the file, and then we have to close the file when the operation has been completed. The basic algorithm is to start by opening the file, then either reading from the file, writing to it, or appending to it, and then finally closing the file when we're done. To open a file, we use the fopen function, short for file open. When you do that, you specify the name of the file and also what's called the mode, whether you're reading from the file or writing to the file or appending to the file. The fopen function will locate and open the file, and if it's able to do that, it returns what's called a file identifier number, which is then saved in a variable, and that becomes the way in which you refer to the file. The general form of the use of the fopen function is you pass two arguments to it. The first is the name of the file that you're opening as a string. The second is called the permission string. In its simplest form, that's R if you're reading, or W if you're writing, or A if you're appending to the file. R for reading is the default. Once the fopen function returns the file identifier, we store that in a variable, which I will typically call FID, but it's just a variable. You can name it anything that you want. It's possible that the fopen won't work. It'll fail, for example, if you're trying to read from the file and it doesn't exist. In that case, instead of returning the file identifier number, the fopen function returns a -1. So you should really check in the program to make sure that the fopen was successful. Once the file use has been completed, we have to close the file using the fclose function. It's actually also possible for the fclose to fail if, for example, the file is corrupted in some way. The fclose function returns 0 if the file close was successful, or -1 if the file close was not successful. And again, you should really check and notify the user whether the file close was successful or not. There are two general forms for calling the fclose function. We can call it and pass to it a file identifier, and it will close just that particular file. Or you can pass the string all, which will close all of the open files. Again, the fclose function returns a number, -1, if it was not successful. So we store that in a variable, and then that should be checked. So here's generic code for just the file open and the file close parts. We start by attempting to open a file using fopen. If we just pass the name of the file, then that assumes that we're opening it for reading, so we don't have to pass the permission string. The fopen function is going to return a number, and we store that in a variable, FID. So first we're going to check to see whether the fopen was successful or not. If the value of FID is equal to 1, that means it was not successful, so we display some kind of error message. Else, we're going to go ahead and use the file in some way. So either read from the file, or write to the file, or append to the file. Then when we're finished, we're going to attempt to close the file and check that result just to let the user know, If close result was equal to 0, then the file close was successful, otherwise it was not successful. The user may want to know, for example, if the file was corrupted. So the middle part, using the file, that can be either reading from the file or writing to or appending to. Let's start with file input, how you read from the file. There are several different file input functions that we can use in MATLAB. The fscanf function is going to read formatted data into a matrix, converting all of the characters that you happen to have to their ASCII equivalents, so that all of the values in the matrix are numbers. They're all the same type. The textscan function will read the data from a file into column vectors and then store all of those column vectors in a cell array. Two other functions, fgetL and fgetS, read strings from a file one line at a time. If there's a new line character at the end of the line, fgetS keeps it, whereas fgetL gets rid of it. That's the difference between these two. These two functions only read one line from the file at a time, and so when you use these, you put them in a while loop that will read until you get to the end of the file. We'll work with the fgetL function first. So the fgetL function is used to read the next line from a file as a string. Once you have the line from the file as a string, you use string manipulation functions. And since the fgetL function reads only one line, we place that in a loop that keeps going until the end of file is reached. So how do we know that? There's a built-in function called FEOF, short for file end of file, to which you pass a file identifier, and it will tell you whether you're at the end of that particular file or not. So FEOF will return logical 1 for true if the end of the file has been reached, or logical false if not. So there are basically two ways that we could specify the condition in the while loop. We can say while FEOF of our file identifier is equal to 0, so while it's false that we're at the end of the file. Or you could use the not operator and say while not FEOF, so that says while we're not at the end of the file, specified by FID. So while we're not at the end of the file, that means there's something else in the file. So we use fgetL to read the next line from the file as a string and store that in a string variable. I named it A line. So then once you have the line from the file stored in a string, you're going to use string manipulation functions to do something with that string. So for example, if there are numbers in there, you want to extract the numbers, convert them to actual numbers, and so forth. So basically, you're reading each line from the file and you're doing something with the data. Here's an example using fgetL. So let's say the file has the following format. In each line of the file, we have a number and we have a character. So here's code that will read this and just echo print the data. We're going to say while we're not at the end of the file, while FEOF FID is equal to 0, we're going to read the next line from the file into a string variable A line. Now we know that each line in the file stores a number and then a space and then a character. So we can use the string token function to break that string into two separate pieces. So this is going to give us the first part of the string, the token, in the variable num, and the second part, the rest of it, in a variable called charcode. So num is going to be a string that stores the 5.3. So then what we want to do is to take that string and convert it to an actual number, and then charcode is going to store the rest of it, the space and the character A. So we can print that out, the number once we've converted it using %.2f, and the string, which will be the space A for the first line, using %s. So again, this is in a while loop. We keep going while we're not at the end of the file. So then we'd read the next line, again as a string, 2.2 space B. Use string token to convert that split that into two strings, and then convert the actual number into a number. So convert the string that stores the number into a number, and then the character code.